Steve Jones sat on the back terrace, watching the sunset on the sea. Perhaps they should have moved here years ago. The beauty and tranquility of this place was mesmerizing. Here means a small island off the north coast of Cornwall. For most of their 22 years of marriage, Steve's wife Claire hinted, cajoled, and finally persuaded him to move from London to here, where she and countless generations of her family had grown up. Improved communications and technology, and finally, COVID, allowed him to do enough work from home to make it viable, with trips to the capital limited to once a month. Claire, living in London, regularly returned to the island to visit family and friends, and most importantly, to see her mother. They bought the house from Claire's cousin 2 years ago, but only moved in 6 months ago. In the meantime, Claire spent her visits making repairs, using it as a base after the major building work was completed. The house faced west onto the bay and had a spectacular sunset that Steve admired while sipping a cool beer. The property was an old farm, and there were still meadows and orchards nearby, and it looked like a few new trees had been planted, no doubt part of Claire's landscaping the previous spring. Trees and orchards seemed to be a feature of the entire island, and Steve wondered if they were intended to provide shelter from the strong sea breezes or, most likely, to produce the much-loved cider of the locals. He had to admit it was a good move. Claire was right. It's a different pace of life among close circles, many of whom were Claire's relatives. Claire was happy to be back home and seemed to know everyone on the island. As an outsider, Steve felt a certain coldness from the locals, but he liked their straightforward manners. The way everyone had come together was impressive, and he wondered if it had something to do with the independence necessary for the survival of a small island community. Steve met Claire at university. Both studied business. Claire majored in marketing, and Steve majored in new technologies. They developed a strong relationship and married shortly after graduating, deciding to live in London for better work opportunities. They've been married for 22 years, but Steve still thinks Claire is beautiful. Over time, her hair became shorter, now pulled back and ending at the back of her head, and a golden hue was added to her usual blonde color. He knew she was worried about the 4.5 pounds she had gained over the years, but he liked that her figure had become rounder, her hips and bust more curvy. Her eyes remained unchanged, blue-gray with yellow specks in the irises. Unlike Steve, she never looked disheveled or wore sweatpants, maintaining a classic look. He had never seen his wife so happy, so involved in the life of the island and constantly participating in the work of one committee or another. Her current project involved organizing a solstice festival. Their 2 daughters, Nicole and Michelle, were born immediately after the wedding, grew up and went to study at Durham University. This was another factor that prompted Steve and Claire to move. Judging by their social media, the girls were enjoying university life to the fullest, but Steve was confident that they had time to get all the necessary work done, although Nicole tended to leave everything until the last minute. Steve was interested in the history of the island and enjoyed listening to old fishing stories in the local pub. There were several old books published, which gave an idea of the history of the island. These were kept in a small schoolhouse, which served as a library, as well as the village hall and venue for all social events. Steve looked around the attic of his house for the first time, thinking he might find something more about the history of the place. Mostly there were old beds, furniture, and toys. While digging around, he found an old box containing a handwritten manuscript called Tales from the Island. He made out the author's name, Melissa Taylor, and immediately discovered that it was his wife's surname. He sat down on a wicker stool and began leafing through. The handwriting was beautiful, a traditional font with swirls and flourishes, and the content was a mixture of stories and the author's experiences passed down through generations. Steve's attention was drawn to drawings of trees as he flipped through the pages. His eyes skimmed over the content. Some of it was faded and hard to see, but he could catch snippets. The tradition was founded in 1287. It was then, during the reign of the Plantagenets, that the law of the first night, also known as the jus primae noctis, law of the first night, was applied. As part of the marriage license, the ruling lord had the right to spend the first night with any new bride within his lands. Steve could remember a similar reference in the William Wallace movie starring Mel Gibson, but he was sure that this was a myth conveniently picked up by Hollywood to add a little voyeurism and excitement to the film's plot. Steve continued reading. Seeing the suffering this caused the groom, and in order to prevent any attempt at murderous revenge, the female elders spent one night with the groom. Over time, this escalated to one of the older women sleeping with the groom to ensure some parity for the couple. For 2.5 centuries, the plague dominated English life, wiping out the population. The island was not immune to the disease, and there were many deaths on it. Following a severe epidemic in 1622, there were concerns that the island's population might not be sustainable, and abandonment of the island was seriously considered. Sometime after this, rumors appeared about the substitution of partners on April Fool's Day. This was associated with efforts to populate the island, and widows were encouraged to seek partners among young men. At the outbreak of the Great War, almost all the men on the island enlisted in the British Army's PALs. Many young men did not return, so changes were made to the island's tradition to provide young unmarried men going to war with a surrogate partner before conscription. This practice was resumed to a lesser extent during the Second World War. The text goes on to detail Melissa's own experiences in the 1950s. The arrival of non-locals and the displacement of people undermine the tradition, but it still exists among some families. The elders insist that this is a tradition and that it has its value. Married women who have raised children are offered surrogacy for a young man who has reached the age of 18. For men, it relieves all the worries and pressure associated with losing their virginity. They also receive guidance from an experienced woman and end up becoming better husbands in the future. Divorce is unheard of on the island. This tradition also reduced the likelihood of unwanted pregnancy during adolescence. For women, it is seen as part of a community service, with a hint of reward after years of hard work raising children. Tradition also reduced the influence of the empty nest and the likelihood of illicit affairs. Melissa went on to talk about her own surrogacy for a fine young gentleman who had reached the age of 18, at which time she was 46. While her husband was busy with business, a young man, Robert, was working on their small plot of land, planting trees as a sign of renewal as part of the festival. His reward was time in Melissa's marital bed. The text gives the impression that Melissa's husband knew, but never spoke about this arrangement. She described Robert's development from a shy and awkward teenager to a man. The first time was quick and awkward, but Melissa held him close, slowly making love. As the week went on, his abilities and confidence grew. It wasn't just the physical side of things. She explained to him her desires and feelings, as well as the important aspects of maintaining a successful relationship. Steve shook his head. Wow, what an amazing story, and began to wonder how much everything this is true. He could see some reason in the historical references, but everything seemed too far-fetched. All this could be the author's imagination, or she may have used it to justify her novel. A few months later, Steve was deciding when he needed to return to the city for work. Claire had a long shopping list that she wanted him to do, so he decided it would be best to add one day to it and another to see old friends. If he goes after the festival, he can return by next Saturday. Claire was thrilled, no doubt because Steve would be there to help with the festival preparations and that he had agreed to do her shopping. The festival day involved the entire island, with the day focusing on children's games and sports, with dancing and drinks planned for the adults in the evening. As the evening's program began, Steve was introduced to some of the island's residents he had not yet met, including John Fraser, his wife Angela, and their son Jake, who Steve thought was close to his youngest daughter's age. Jake Fraser introduced himself with a rather formal handshake, which was a little strange. But that moment soon passed. Along with the Taylors, the Frasers were one of the island's oldest families. Steve felt like an outsider again, while Claire and the Frasers discussed old family ties. Later in the evening, Steve noticed a group of young men looking at Claire. He couldn't blame them. Claire looked stunning in the summer dress she'd chosen, which certainly showed off her full breasts and shapely calves. The looks continued, which began to irritate Steve. He was about to approach, but Claire's mother beat him to it, forcing them all to hurriedly return to the cider bar. Steve laughed to himself, thinking that they must be a little wary of Claire's mom, Diana. On the other hand, he couldn't blame them. She was a formidable woman and the leader of the Council of Elders. Steve could see where Claire got her looks from. Diana Taylor remained a striking woman, more like Claire's older sister than her mother. He returned to watch the dancing, which seemed to involve all ages. Steve could feel the effects of the cider, but decided he could drink more. Everyone seemed to be in the same mood, and it took him forever to help himself. When he returned, he did not see Claire and began to look around. He was surprised to find her sitting at the table talking with Jake Fraser, who had moved away when Steve approached. "What do you mean?" Steve asked. "Jake is interested in carrying out some landscaping work. I asked about options and costs." "Do we have work?" "Yes, and there is a tradition of planting and renewing trees around the time of the festival, so that will be great." The mention of trees brought back memories of a manuscript Steve had read a few weeks ago. "So, Jake will plant trees?" "Yes, he can start next week." Claire looked at Steve. "Are you okay? It looks like you saw a ghost." Steve answered slowly. "What will Jake get in return?" "Money, of course, but we haven't agreed on the amount yet. Would you provide any other services in exchange for his work?" "What are you suggesting?" Steve continued. "So, this has nothing to do with the traditions of the island?" Claire hissed. What? What traditions?" "You know very well about the tradition of the solstice. You're in it? Planning to have sex with Jake Fraser while I'm gone next week?" Claire burst into tears and ran away. Steve stood there stunned. Hell, what if he was wrong and just falsely accused Claire? He was already beginning to regret drinking so much. His mind was clouded, and he couldn't think clearly. He began to climb up the single-track road towards their house. He needed a walk to clear his head. This walk was the longest of his life. Maybe he misunderstood something. Maybe he overreacted to this story. When I came home, Claire was not at home. He collapsed on the sofa, alcohol and fatigue finally getting the better of his thoughts, and he fell asleep. The next morning, he noticed that Claire had not returned home and thought that she might have spent the night with her lover, but he suspected that she was with her mother. This suspicion was confirmed when Claire and Diana appeared at the door. Her mother led the conversation, talking about not backing down, and she launched a verbal attack on Steve. There were so many words it was hard to keep track, but the gist of it was, how dare he talk to Claire like that? How dare he upset her? Nothing good comes from marrying a stranger. He was never good enough for her, and so on and so forth. Similar. He let her speak, looking at Claire with wet eyes. Finally, he had enough and raised his hand, trying to get her mom to stop. "I have a simple question. Is there such a tradition? And are you planning to go to bed with Jake Fraser next week?" Claire turned to her mother with a defeated look, and everything became clear to Steve. "Yes, Steve, some old families still have the tradition, or at least part of it. The Frasers have requested implementation of the agreement, and we are obliged to fulfill it. I asked Claire to think about it. It's about everything related to a boy reaching maturity. Sex is only educational in nature and talks about how to treat a woman correctly. This is not sex in your understanding and not an affair. This is a centuries-old tradition that has helped the island survive difficult times. It is an absolute requirement that we fulfill this role on behalf of society. We have no youth crime, no divorces, just happy marriages and families with strong ties. You probably noticed this yourself." Steve sighed. "So it's all true. Married women are entertaining thirsty young guys in the name of the public good." Diana replied, "Don't be so vulgar. You're a stranger and you don't know how important this is to us. It's ingrained in every story we hear growing up here. If you were from here, you'd get all the benefits at 18, and that would make you a better man. I doubt you would refuse this offer. Steve replied, Now there are no ancient laws, plagues, or wars. You do it because you enjoy it. Tell me, Diana, how many times have you played this role? An attractive woman like you was probably asked for several executions of the agreement. I bet you've had a lot of fun for weeks. Finally, Diana seemed speechless, but then recovered. Yes, I have fulfilled my duties several times, and I am proud of it, just as you should be proud of Claire's sacrifice. I beg you, Steve, let Claire do this. You can't understand how important it is to us. Steve turned to his wife. So you want to do this? I think so. I'm ready to make this sacrifice. Like my mother said, I want to become part of society. No one was happy when I left for university, got married, didn't come back here, and didn't fulfill the responsibilities that fell to others. Steve replied, So this is a sacrifice? Don't you strive for this yourself? It seems strange, considering that you were so happy that I was going to London, you were so excited. Claire blushed and then continued, I just felt relieved that I could arrange everything and ensure that it wouldn't affect you. And it will not affect me, I am absolutely sure of that. This will not affect our relationship with you in any way. Besides having sex with another man, lying, other people knowing what happened, and keeping your clueless husband in the dark, you might be right. Claire and Diana winced at Steve's sarcastic response. Then Diana spoke. Why don't we all give ourselves time to calm down and discuss everything? Now all the cards are on the table, as they should be, and nothing has happened yet. Claire stayed at their house, but they hardly spoke. Steve just couldn't understand why Claire thought she wanted to go through with this. He expected her to simply give up on the idea, but she seemed obsessed with the island's tradition, regardless of the cost to their relationship. Claire insisted that if everything was out in the open, everything would be better. She promised to be honest with Steve, even if it meant difficult conversations. Steve was partly surprised by her absolute faith and assertion that such an agreement would not affect their relationship. Diana returned on Wednesday while Claire was in the village, and he suspected that they had agreed upon a time between themselves. Can we talk, Steve? Steve nodded towards the kitchen table and they sat down. First of all, I'd like to apologize. This shouldn't have happened, and it's my fault, not Claire's. Steve replied, Claire is more than capable of making her own decisions, and this decision seems to have already been made, regardless of my opinion. She loves you very much, and is confident that you are strong enough as a couple to get through this. Steve answered gloomily, In fact, you both don't notice how much this affects me. This is a real betrayal. I wasn't here when I was 18. And unlike everyone else, I didn't live my life knowing that this could happen to my wife. I naively believed that my wife would be faithful to me, as in wedding vows. I understand, Steve, and it must be incredibly difficult to explain how differently we look at things. We don't see it as infidelity, it's really important to us, and I know Claire sees it as a way to get back into the island community. After a short silence, Diana continued, What will you do if she agrees to this? Steve sighed, not wanting to say the words, but said anyway, I won't stand for this. Diana seemed to weigh the situation before speaking. What if there's a way to even things out? Maybe give you the opportunity to experience what you missed when you were 18. Steve must have looked as confused as he felt, Diana continued. I talked to 2 other elders. We agreed that the elders would offer you an agreement similar to what Claire is doing. A realization finally flashed through Steve's head. Are you suggesting that I have sex with Helen Brown or Moira Fraser? Memories of meeting these 2 women flashed through Steve's head. Helen, a widow from a young age. Steve assumed she was about his wife's age, with long black hair and deep brown eyes. She maintained a trim figure and was certainly an attractive woman. Steve didn't know Moira Fraser that well, but he knew that she was happily married and related to the other Frasers. She is the headmistress of a small school. With mixed reddish-blonde curly hair, she has a more graceful figure, often showing off ample cleavage. Steve looked up from his memories. Yes, Steve, the elders are willing to offer this, and I hope it shows you how much this all means to us. We didn't just put Claire in this position carelessly. Despite the obvious temptation, Steve thought the whole proposal was absurd. "You are an amazing woman, Diana, and also an elder. Aren't you also on the menu?" Diana hesitated, not sure if Steve was serious. "If this is what you need, Steve, then yes, I agree. I will not be the one who is responsible for the loss of centuries-old traditions." Steve shook his head, amazed at the lengths Diana would go to. He had a terrible feeling about how he would try to explain this agreement to his father and the law. "You know, Diana, some traditions have outlived their time, and it's right that they should fade away." Diana's smile faded. "Our offer stands, Steve, and you won't be disappointed. I can guarantee that. Think carefully." When Steve relayed the story to Claire, she already seemed to know about the elder's proposal, but Diana's inclusion left her in shock and crying. "I never thought that she would think about this. It's all too much." "I won't do that, Steve. All this must stop." Steve felt a wave of relief, finally admitting that this whole scenario was just weird. "Thank God. I can't tell you how glad I am. I thought this would be our end." Claire cried and spent most of the night either apologizing or repeating how much she loved Steve. The situation remained awkward and uncertain, with Steve still struggling with Claire's previous intentions and her view that the agreement was reasonable. On Friday, Diana returned, clearly furious about Claire's reconsideration, accusing Steve of being a manipulative bully and an outsider who could never understand her. Steve is tired of ranting. "Why don't you be honest, Diana, and admit that for you this is just a way to mock your husband?" Diana almost had a stroke. "Okay, if you want to know the truth, we're having a great time. A fit young guy in our bed, doing exactly what we say when we say it, is a dream come true. We give them everything repeatedly, and everyone in the Fraser family is gifted as." "Can you believe it?" Claire moaned. "Lord, Mom, shut up. You're ruining everything." Steve responded with a laugh. "Don't stop her. This is the most honest thing I've heard from her." Diana wanted to say something else, but Claire stopped her, asking her to leave and not come back until she agreed with her decision. It was the first time Steve had seen Claire confront Diana, and he couldn't tell who was more shocked when Diana ran out of the house. Over the next few weeks, the situation remained difficult. Claire constantly apologized for even considering this arrangement and for asking Steve to accept it. She was tied to tradition by her mother and did not think about the consequences. Steve was in a dilemma about going to the city for work. He couldn't put it off any longer, but the thought of leaving Claire on the island terrified him. Claire sensed his anxiety and insisted on going with him, taking time off from work. The gap with her mother grew even greater. They did not speak. And Claire never mentioned the tradition again. After much thought and worry, Steve decided that he needed to trust Claire and go on a journey alone. Claire again tried to convince Steve that she could come with him, but he knew that she was in the middle of working on a major marketing proposal and needed time to prepare. Claire promised daily calls and frequent contact. Steve went to London. Ferry, taxi, train, and subway meant that he was tired and collapsed on his hotel bed at 9 in the evening. He called Claire, who answered quickly, and they exchanged details of his trip and what had changed in the city during a long conversation. London was an endless stream of construction work. After the conversation, Steve immediately fell asleep, exhausted. He had had a few stressful days at work, but he felt refreshed. Being off the island had helped him clear his thoughts. He began to reflect on his relationship with Claire and mentally replay some of their conversations. The man who was so intent on trying to have a relationship with a younger man seemed as distant from the woman he married as he was from the caring mother of his children. He felt that Diana had too much influence over her and was glad they had a fight. She had gone too far, and he hoped it would end there. Still, he couldn't come to terms with Claire's actions and why she was so sure that this agreement would not affect their relationship, and these thoughts continued to bother him. Suddenly, remembering the trees that had been planted on his property the previous spring, Steve froze. Claire had been visiting the island regularly throughout the previous year. A feeling of horror came over him when he thought about who could have planted these trees. Perhaps she fought so hard for it this time because she needed to justify her previous actions. He called Claire, and she answered quickly again. Steve began. "Doesn't Jake Fraser have an older brother?" There was a pause before Claire responded casually. "Yes, I think there is." "You're just thinking, even though your families go back a long way?" There was a break. "Yes, Steve, he has a brother named Glenn." Steve continued. "He's about 19? More hesitation before she quietly whispered, "Yes." "And last year it was he who planted the trees?" There was no answer. Steve continued. "And what did Glenn Fraser get for this?" Claire recovered from her thoughts. "Only money, Steve. Their family is the only one on the island who does landscaping." "So you're not entertaining Jake Fraser right now as we speak?" Claire sighed. "No, Steve, I'm not entertaining, and you need to forget about this jealousy." Before she could say anything else, Steve hung up. Calls from Claire came repeatedly, but Steve ignored them all. He needed time to think. He finally answered the phone on Friday morning, surprising Claire. "Steve, thank God you answered. I was worried." "Indeed?" That's all Steve answered. "Of course, I love you more than anything in the world. What time will you be back tomorrow, should we talk about this?" Steve responded in a calm tone that worried Claire. "I won't come back. I'll stay here for a while." Claire panicked. "Please don't do this. We need to sort this out as soon as possible." Steve responded again in an eerily calm tone. "Oh, that's true. But you didn't rush to London to do it, and only called me during the day. I understand your evenings have remained somewhat busy. Please, Steve, come home. I didn't do anything. It's just your paranoia. Just come home and we can work things out." 5 days later, Steve was returning to the island by ferry. When he reached the house, Claire was already waiting for him with Diana. Apparently, the message had been conveyed to her. Claire tried to hug and kiss him, but Steve pulled her away from him. Claire began to sob, and Diana looked furious. "Why are you here, Diana? This only applies to me and Claire. Do I understand correctly that you never quarreled?" Before Diana could answer, Claire began to explain. "We actually had a fight, but when you didn't come home, I needed someone, and you weren't here." Steve frowned. "It's hard to believe that my mother-in-law would make peace with someone if she didn't get her way. Given her efforts to reach an agreement, I doubt she would back down. I assume you never fought, and it was all a cover?" Claire's eyes widened. "This is getting out of control, Steve. I didn't do anything." Steve continued. "So you both agreed to lie and hide it because I wouldn't do it?" The argument continued, but went in circles. Steve was sure that Claire had cheated, but she denied everything. Eventually, he went into the spare room and left Claire and Diana alone. The next day, Steve decided to meet with his father-in-law, Bill Taylor, knowing that the conversation would not be easy. They always got along well, and Bill started with a friendly handshake, saying he'd been waiting for Steve. They talked about tradition and what Bill had learned. Bill realized that about 20 years ago, Diana had a one-night stand with John Fraser. He didn't like it, but it was like a night he'd thoroughly enjoyed when he was 18. Steve spent some time carefully laying out Diana's admission of a few week-long dates, asking if it was possible. Bill was upset, but said he always had an inkling that something else was going on, and his going on a commercial fishing trip provided ample opportunity. Steve asked Bill if he knew about his daughter's actions. Bill confirmed that Diana and Claire are inseparable, but tried to hide information from him. A week before Steve left for London, they said that the plan is already ready. Claire sat at the kitchen table, unable to look at Steve. "I can't believe that my dad is going to divorce my mom and that we are the reason for this." Diana made her own bed. "Your father would never agree to this level of deceit and lies." She still denies everything, although John Fraser admitted the truth, and he is not the only one. After a long silence, Claire whispered, "I know, and that's why I think I should tell you something." Steve didn't answer. "Sorry, Steve, but I made a deal with Jake." The explosion Claire expected never happened. And last year with Glenn Fraser? Claire nodded silently. Steve couldn't think of what to say. Please, Steve, this shouldn't change us. We've had 22 fantastic years. How can you say that? This changes everything. I'm so sorry, Steve. I thought I had to fulfill family obligations. Steve was seething with anger. What nonsense! You just wanted to have sex with another man. I did it and enjoyed it so much that I repeated it again. It wasn't like that. It was a duty, an obligation. So you didn't enjoy it? Claire hesitated, knowing that she was on very dangerous ground. Everything was ordinary, not like ours, just sex, not lovemaking. It was one time, it won't happen again. Only this wasn't a one-time thing, you did it twice. You had sex with both your brothers when they were barely 18, which makes you nothing more than a slut. Claire recoiled from Steve's verbal attack. I'm not like that. I was supporting a tradition, part of educating young men on the road to manhood, that's all. They were very grateful. Claire realized she had made another mistake as soon as she said this. Steve shouted, "Oh, I bet they were damn grateful. You say it was one time, but how many times did you do this before you raised them? Tell me how many times. If I'm 18 years old, I'm damn eager to please, and I have a woman on hand for the evening and all night. It has to be at least 5 times a day, so maybe 35 once a week. It is unlikely to be just once." Claire couldn't deny it. Both Glenn and Jake were eager to please. There was very little training required, although some patience was required at the beginning of the week. She enjoyed their pumped-up and toned bodies. Just as her mother had predicted, the sex was exciting. She especially enjoyed teasing each of them with glimpses of stockings or cleavage, knowing that that night she would completely surrender to them. At one point, Jake even admitted that he was in love with her. It was the only time it occurred to her that a week could affect her normal life and the marriage she treasured, and she wasted no time in explaining to Jake the reality of what was happening. Steve's flow of speech continued. And what exactly does an 18-year-old need these days? I bet they had their eye on you from day one and you couldn't get enough, could you? Claire sobbed. It's not like that. It was supposed to be a fun adventure. It was just sex. I know it hurts your ego, but still, I only want you, and you are the one who makes me complete. Steve got angry. I would say it's more about trust and vows than ego. What about your wedding vows? Does tradition trump them? It's not ego when your life partner betrays you, and for what? Not for anything serious or serious consequences, but for the sake of traditional sex with some children. Claire blushed. I understand that you are angry and upset with me, but you are strong enough for us to get through this. After Glenn, you didn't recognize anything, didn't notice anything, but we became closer. I thought it would be the same with Yakey. I didn't know because I trusted the woman I loved selflessly. Believe me, I will never do anything like that again. Should I believe you? Believe it? You must be joking. Claire almost shouted back. You can do it, I swear. I'm really sorry that I hurt you. Think about the wonderful life we still have left. We can go back to the way things were. Did you think about our wonderful life when you were planning all this and lying on your back? No, I would never have thought about this if I had known about the consequences. I would never intentionally hurt you. But I did it anyway. I know. And I'm really sorry. And what do you think came of it? Claire didn't know what to say. Obviously, you don't understand how I feel. You tore out my heart and soul. How the hell can you fix this, Claire? With that, Steve stormed off before he did something he would regret. He just kept walking, trying to clear his head, the beauty of the evening sunset doing little to improve his mood. When I turned back towards the village, I was surprised to meet Elder Helen Brown. Steve could barely return the greeting with a nod. Helen smiled and admitted that their meeting was not accidental. She saw Steve go out onto the path leading to the cliff and knew that she would be able to catch up with him when he returned. Helen offered to sit on a rock ledge and then cautiously asked Steve if he would tell him anything about his circumstances. Steve saw no reason for silence and told her everything. Saying it out loud did not lift the weight off his shoulders. Helen listened attentively without interrupting. He was hesitant to mention Diana's offer to have one of the elders have sex with him in exchange for Claire fulfilling her obligations, but decided that Helen had played a part in the whole saga and included it verbatim. When he finished, Helen was silent for a long time before she said, "Steve, I did not make such an offer. Diana never mentioned or discussed any agreements with me or Moira. This is not something we could consider. I can only think that Diana was trying to get you to admit or agree to sex with others outside of marriage to justify what they had planned." Steve was puzzled by her answer. Helen continued, "One more thing, Steve, these arrangements mostly disappeared decades ago, and even then it was only the first night, never a week. The only elements that lasted a week were housework or planting, with one night of union at the end. Maybe Melissa, Diana, and Susan acted according to circumstances." Steve just shook his head. Every time he began to come to terms with his wife's behavior, a new shock occurred. Helen continued by saying that she would speak with Moira and take the necessary steps to ensure that Diana was stripped of her elder status. As far as she knows, this has never happened before, and it will be a scandal. But Diana's actions are unforgivable. Nowadays, elders must engage in social activities and support the inhabitants of the island. Helen looked at Steve. "What are you going to do?" Steve shrugged. "I can't make her understand the consequences of her actions, but I would like her to feel what I feel now." They sat in silence for a while before Steve noticed a faint smile at the corner of Helen's mouth. "What is it that you are thinking about?" Helen's smile widened as she began. "What if you stay with me for a week? No joke. But we shouldn't tell Claire and Diana about this. We will say that I feel honored to accept the agreement that was offered on my behalf as an elder. So you give Claire a taste of her own medicine, and I get to torment Diana for dragging my name into all this nonsense." Steve was delighted at this prospect, but asked, "Won't this ruin your reputation? I'm still a married man, and everyone will think—" Helen interrupted him. "First of all, I don't care what people think. And secondly, I'm sorry to say this, but almost the entire island already knows about your situation, Steve." The thought of everyone knowing was another blow, but it was replaced by a pleasant thought that Steve shared with Helen. "No joke, but I would love to plant some trees for you. This will give Claire and Diana pause." They laughed together and quickly settled all the issues. Steve returned to his home and quickly packed his things. All he explained to Claire was that, on reflection, he had decided to accept her mother's kind offer regarding the elder of the island. And, under the circumstances, a week with another woman would be more than reasonable. He left Claire crying and begging him not to do it. His stay with Helen was surprisingly comfortable. She was great company and a wonderful cook. Steve spent time renovating the house and actually planted some trees in the backyard. They discussed Steve's situation. He hoped that this week would give Claire some insight into how he was feeling. Until he saw many other things that convinced him that Claire understood how wrong her actions were, there was no chance for them to reconcile. True to his word, he never slept with Helen, although they came very close a couple of times, and it was not due to a lack of desire. It was not long before Claire caught up with Helen at the village store and immediately began to reproach her for having an affair with her husband. Helen smiled sweetly. "Claire, dear, you, of all people, should know that this is not an affair. It is an agreement, and it will not affect your marriage." Claire heard an echo of her own words, but continued, "You can't do this. He's my husband. In fact, I am fulfilling the offer made by your own mother on my behalf. What was there? Me, Moira, or even your mom for a week? I think Steve made his choice, and I am obliged to honor the tradition. It could have been worse. He could have chosen Diana. I promise to return him safe and sound, although he may be a little exhausted." Claire gasped. You, old slut." Helen answered calmly, "I would have thought that name would be more appropriate for one of us who had sex with two 18-year-old boys behind her faithful husband's back." With that, Helen stormed off, leaving Claire with her mouth open as everyone in the village shop stared at her. The next day, an enraged and hysterical Claire made a worthy attempt to kick down Helen's front door before Steve opened it. "Please, Steve, I'm so sorry. Come home. I'm just doing what you did. Why are you so upset? Because, like you said, this shouldn't concern us. I had no idea. It's just cruel. It torments me. I can't stop thinking about you and that old woman." Steve replied, "Yes, it sounds familiar. Welcome to my world," and quickly slammed the door. Steve returned to his home the following week and was greeted by a much more reserved Claire. Claire began, "I can't believe you did this to me, but I can forgive you if you can. I understand how you feel about all this. That's just what you think. You have still only experienced part of it, not the deception and lies. Our entire time here is based on lies." Claire persisted. "We are still the same people, the same marriage. The same marriage that inspired you to jump into bed with other men, a marriage that you destroyed, and I still can't understand why you did it. Are you really that tired of me? It was never about you or boredom. If we can't go back, we can build something new. Let's look forward to all those retirement dreams, to the things we could have together. Travel, grandchildren, we can still do it all. We still love each other no matter what. It's not over yet, Steve. I will do anything to prove my love for you." Steve stayed in the house in the spare room, almost overcome with frightening thoughts about what the hell he would do with his life if he left Claire. He couldn't decide whether failure or abyss best described his prospects. It's easier to stay, and he still loves her. Given the consequences, he doubted Claire's actions would be repeated. The island was idyllic, and he had dreamed of traveling, spent years planning his options and sharing those dreams with Claire. Did he really want to give it all up? Claire wondered how it had all come to this. It was all so confusing. When her mother proposed an agreement, she rejected the offer, but Diana continued to pester her for several months. Then she saw Glenn Fraser at a dance. He was very handsome and delightfully respectful. She danced with him several times at social events, and they got along well. Deanna told her about her own arrangements and how exciting they were. She talked about it as a guilt-free romantic adventure and never viewed it as an affair. It was just tradition. Despite this, she knew Steve didn't think so, so she hid everything. If he never found out, it wouldn't hurt him. The week with Glenn was fantastic. During the day, he planted trees and spent the evenings in her bed. He was very nervous, but very charming, and so eager to please. By the end of the week, he had become a very competent lover, combining his size and physicality with great patience and technique. Claire excelled as a teacher. The week filled her with confidence. She felt that she had rediscovered her sexuality, which had faded during the long years of motherhood. Was it tradition, or just illicit sex, as Steve suggested? She had to admit it was both. But didn't she deserve a little satisfaction after spending 22 years raising children and being a good wife? She was sure that it didn't hurt her relationship with Steve. Things had never been so good. She loved him more than ever, and after that week, they started making love more often. Jake was even more handsome, and she couldn't help but feel aroused at the thought of taking him to her bed. Steve was always smart and uncovered the tradition, and Aunt Melissa's memoirs be damned for giving it all away. Claire and her mother tried to convince Steve to agree, but he didn't go for it. Come to think of it, her decision to go behind his back was the worst she had ever made. However, she was confident that when the pain subsided, she would be able to bring Steve back. She just needed to remind him of how good they had it together and of their future aspirations. He will also want to stay together for the sake of their daughters and future grandchildren, and this angle could help her in her case. To Steve's surprise, their daughters arrived on the island 2 days later. Nicole wasted no time in criticizing Steve for his terrible behavior towards her mother, pointing out that the idea of living apart was simply ridiculous. Michelle seemed to be lying low, waiting for more information. Steve noticed a slight smile on Claire's face. Had he not noticed her manipulations and lies over the years? Apparently, she thought he wouldn't tell his daughters anything about their mother's actions, protecting them first, as always. All of Steve's doubts were cleared, but Claire was wrong. completely wrong. Steve raised his voice in a way his daughters could never remember. Your mother had been having affairs for 2 weeks with men, boys, younger than both of you, in fact. She doesn't seem to understand that I will never accept this behavior. Claire immediately denied this, saying that Steve had misunderstood the situation and that the men were simply doing landscaping work. Steve had to admit that she was good, almost convinced even him. Both girls knew that something was wrong, but what their father assumed was too far-fetched. Perhaps he was starting to go a little crazy. Steve might agree with that last thought, but he suggested they invite Grandpa Bill or the elders to help decide who was telling the truth. Claire fainted, or rather, she pretended to. It wasn't very convincing. All three just looked at her in bewilderment and waited for an equally poorly conceived recovery. Steve looked at her with contempt. I can never trust you again. It's all over. There's no turning back or forward with flashing lights. How you will feel when you look in the mirror and know that you betrayed me? Nothing can erase that. And how will I feel looking in the same mirror if I accept this? We need each other, Steve. We always depended on each other. It made each of us stronger. I'm right for you, and deep down, you still know it. Don't throw away your life to punish me. I can handle it, Claire, but I won't let you destroy me, and I'll build a new life. We all have to live with our decisions and be true to ourselves. You will have to live with the fact that you cheated, lied, and threw away what we had. I will live with the fact that I left the woman I love, but you are not the one I took you for, not the good and kind person with whom I fell in love. I would like to return her, but not you. Steve left the island with his daughters and decided to rent an apartment closer to their university. In turn, the girls were shocked by the behavior of their mother and grandmother. He never returned. His last act was to burn the trees in the orchard. Claire looked at the orange glow with tears in her eyes. Bill helped Steve sell the house because Claire did not have enough money to maintain it. The divorces of Diana and Claire became a scandal and predetermined the fate of the remnants of the tradition. Diana became the first to be removed from her position as an elder. Both she and Claire became outcasts. No woman trusted them or befriended them, but despite this, they resolutely continued to live on their island. A few months later, Helen Brown resigned as elder. Residents of the island noticed that she divided her time between being on and off the island. Eventually, she began to come only for a couple of weeks a year. When asked about this, she confirmed that she lives with her family, somewhere near a place called Durham. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.